So that barrier is probably one of the most important things. That barrier that separates the inside of the gut with its microbial world from the immune system. That barrier is kind of the key to understanding what's a healthy gut and what happens if that barrier breaks down.
Can you share some insights about how our gut, our microbiome, and our immune system are really interconnected?
So, zooming into our GI tract, it's not just a tube that processes and transports food from the stomach into the intestine. And if you look into deeper with a microscope and dissecting it, you'll notice that it is a very complex organ. So like a few microns, you go inside the wall of the GI tract and you find the biggest part of our immune system. 70% of our immune cells are located in the gut, and you don't see it. They're silent, and they don't just sit there, but they also move throughout the body to other areas and send their signaling molecules if that system is activated throughout the body. The microbes are separated only by, again, this is all in the magnitude of microns, so less than a millimeter. So the microbes are sitting just very close to that immune system location. They're only separated by two things. One is a mucus layer made out of sugar molecules, and the other one is the lining of the gut. These are cells that are very tightly connected to each other. And they separate these 40 trillion microbes from our immune system. So it's kind of an amazing engineering feat that nature has produced there. Who would dare to put some of the most, the most sensitive system in our body, the immune system, that senses everything that's foreign and potentially dangerous from 40 trillion microbes. They're all beneficial to us, the ones that live in our gut. But every once in a while, there's other microbes that you ingest or that get into your GI tract that could kill you. So, so that barrier is probably one of the most important things. That barrier that separates the inside of the gut with its microbial world from the immune system. That barrier is kind of the key to understanding, what's a healthy gut and what happens if that barrier breaks down, because that starts a whole avalanche of things that first localized in the gut, but then it goes throughout the body, reaching all organs.
Yeah, that should be just really startling for us. First of all, that 70% of our immune system is located in our gut. And this interaction with all these 40 trillion microbes and how close proximity that it is, the influence that they have is obvious once you understand that. But you said in our design, and that makes me think about in your book, you mentioned how we often refer to the gut as the second brain, but it's really the first brain.
It is the first brain. And so in evolution, the first marine animals called hydras, and there's still descendants of these animals around today. They were basically a floating digestive tube, tiny, a few millimeters, and they had a nerve net wrapped around them. And so it was, so the the first life form was a very simple digestive tube, and which ingested things from in one end and expelled the residue on the other end. And this nerve net that was wrapped around this tube regulated the contractions and the expulsion of waste material. That design, this is another amazing thing. That design from really, billions of years ago has been maintained in pretty much all life forms. So bees, cockroaches, snakes, fish have that design, that you have a nervous system wrapped around the gut. And what happened at some point, so this is like the enteric nervous system, and later from that, developed in more complex animals. We need a central nervous system that doesn't just focus on the gut, but focuses on the world around us. And interestingly also that at some point in the ocean, these things were floating around the ocean, that pretty by chance, some microbes that were the dominant life form in the ocean ended up inside this digestive tube and started. This was a very beneficial thing for both, because those microbes living in this floating gut essentially had free transportation, were always exposed to nutrients coming in, and were protected. So this was also maintained in evolution. So two basic design principles, a digestive system with a nervous system around it, and then inside with a microbial population that started to live in symbiosis with the other two systems. And yeah, it is kind of amazing. So the molecules that the microbes brought with them, because they've been living for 3.5 billion years in the oceans and had a lot of time to perfect their communication systems, and all the information that what they tested and what worked out, what didn't work out, was encoded in their genes. So now microbes have 100 times more genes than we humans have. We have 20,000 genes. Microbes have their genes number in the millions, and it's because they had that much longer than humans, time to collect this information, and they transfer that information about how to build neurotransmitters and signaling molecules to the nervous system in the gut. And ultimately, that information made it into our brain. So now, people always ask, how could the microbes even communicate with something complex as the brain? Well, it's because they use the same neurotransmitters and the same signaling molecules, and it came originally from the microbes, not from. So it's not that we gave the microbes our information how to design neurotransmitters. It's the other way around.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. So we've got the enteric nervous system in the gut, and we've got enteroendocrine system in the gut, and that it's like a communication superhighway in a sense. Like we tend to, and I love this that you talk about our reductionism transition in medicine, where we just keep isolating everything when it's really so interconnected. And our development, so we started off, well, our vast long ago roots as just being a tube to kind of extract nutrients, and we eventually sprouted we had this the gut being the first brain, and then we sprouted another brain to handle other things basically. And we see that that's kind of the final frontier, but really our gut and the gut health, it's kind of like all coming back to that. And so what I want to ask you about in this same vein, you mentioned this really important thing, which is the genes. And I think that, when they did the Human Genome Project, for example, we thought we would have like 1 million genes, for example. It's just 20,000. But we have such diversity in who we are. And I think a big part of that is the microbial diversity we carry within us. So can you talk a little bit about that, comparing how many genes we have as humans to the genes that we might carry within our bodies that are microbial?
Yeah, so this is a really important point, because initially, people got excited. They say 99% of our cells are not human, or so talking about the cells, because that's how the science started, are not human and they're bacterial. In the meantime, we know it's about 60 to 40% the ratio. So almost half were human and half were microbial. But if you go to the genus level, not to the genetic level, then you realize that difference is much bigger. So from 20,000 to 40 to 100 million genes in the microbes. And genes, basically, the gene number means information to build things and encode functions. Most of the functions of these genes we don't really know, right. So we're just scraping at the surface of this. But I think the biggest excitement if somebody goes into this field is, what are we going to find out? What all this information does. And what role does it play in things you would never thought about are related to our genes, like brain function and aging, and so there's going to be a lot of these unknown factors, but that I think gives us the greatest. I mean, I sort of come to this point. If you say that genetic information somehow relates to the intelligence of that system, not the individual organism, right. They don't really have intelligence, but it's if you think about a beehive that has, or an anthill that has a certain intelligence as a collective thing. So I think the microbiome, not just in the gut, but also, there's communications with the microbiome in the soil and in the oceans. If you take that system together as one, look at it as one, it's obviously spatially distributed like nothing else, and it's invisible on top of it. That's got to be the most intelligent system on the planet, right. And what that implies, I mean, one thing that we can see, with mass extinction, so we had 5 of those in evolution, that most large animals disappeared. They could not survive these. The microbes didn't. The microbes survived all of this. So they have skills and knowledge and survival information stored how to survive these dramatic climate changes and atmospheric changes. So that's to me, that's one of the most exciting things. That there's something inside of us that we don't see, we can't touch. So you really have to use your imagination to think what goes on in there. But even if you go inside with an endoscope, you don't see it, But that invisible entity that lives in darkness and without oxygen contributes this amazing amount of information to our health and plays a role if it's altered in our disease states.
That's remarkable. So if we go gene for gene, at least 99% of our genes are microbial.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and so when I give my talks, I always show this figure, this schematic figure. It's a white outline of a human being, and it's all white, and that's all microbial genetic information, and has a very thin lining in red, which are the human genes. So it gives you an idea. We're just like, it's this relationship, these dimensions is something awe-inspiring, kind of.
That's powerful. So if we're understanding what genes are, which essentially they're instructions, and if we take that one tenet and understand that 99% of the genetic material that we're carrying around, if we go gene for gene, is microbial, and understanding that they're inherently doing something, these genes or the microbes are inherently doing something, there's obviously going to be a big impact on all of the systems of our bodies. And I love this about your book because you talk about some of the various roles that our gut plays in diseases that affect different organs, like the brain, for example. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so coming back, to this interface in our gut between the microbes, the immune system, the endocrine system in the gut. So the largest part of the endocrine or hormonal system is also there. And that interaction influences what the immune system, what the hormones do that circulate through our body. Nothing stays in the gut. It's all. So people say it's not Vegas. It doesn't stay. It doesn't stay in the gut.
Yeah.
And so these are all long distance signaling mechanisms. And they.
By the way, the vagus nerve is there as well.
Yeah, the vagus nerve is there, and so there's these different communication channels that amplify the signal. What happens in the gut. So to give you one example, you ingest something that the microbes have never seen in evolution, like
a Twinkie.
So yeah, just or a pesticide. Roundup is a good example. They've never seen all of our medications. So the microbes, with their knowledge, they can break this molecule down. They have enzymes that can break this down. They don't say, well, I've never seen this. So they break it down into smaller molecules that then interact with the immune system or with the endocrine system. And then that generates a signal that goes through the body. And depending on your genetic vulnerability, so be it for Alzheimer's disease or be it for depression, when these signals get to the brain, they change the brain in a way that you have now a higher risk of developing these diseases. These microbial signals are not the only cause of these diseases, but in a vulnerable individual, they can trigger the transition from health into disease. And that's so this long distance signaling is clearly, so it can go through what we call neuroactive metabolites. So many things like the amino acid tryptophan, microbes can break it down into other molecules that interact with the nervous system. Some go into the brain, some are turned into serotonin, this ubiquitous signaling molecule. So this is one way that they generate from our food substances that then are distributed through the body and to all organs. Another one is through the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve has 90% of that nerve that connects all our organs with the brain goes from the organ to the brain. So it's so we still don't know what information is all transported in such a nerve. So if something happens at the gut level, microbe produces like short chain fatty acids from breaking down fiber molecules that acts on a receptor on the vagus nerve, and that goes to the brain. And the third one is the cell wall of the microbes itself is a signaling trigger. So there's components like lipopolysaccharide or LPS. When that comes into contact with the receptor on an immune cell, it will trigger the activation of this immune cell, which then produces cytokines. And these cytokines, again, go throughout the body. And so at least 3 parallel communication systems are engaged, which amplify and spread the message throughout the body. It's and if you use this network terminology, the gut is really the hub in this network, in this global mind-body network. Anything that happens at the gut level has a high propensity to influence everything else.
Yeah, and again, that should seem obvious at this point. And you being a pioneer and helping to bring this data to the public and seeing it start to really sprout and show. But you just mentioned that interaction with tryptophan getting converted into serotonin, which is a precursor for melatonin. Mm-hmm. And we tend to think like sleep is a head thing, and a lot of it's rooted in the gut. Or, the big focus, we have a hyper focus when we're talking about anxiety and depression around certain neurotransmitters, which a lot of this is rooted in the gut. And yet a lot of attention isn't going to addressing the real root. And I got to mention this. I actually, when you mentioned the pesticide, it's so funny because I wrote this down earlier and I didn't know if I was going to talk about this, but I was reviewing a study that, and this was published in Scientific Reports, and it revealed that pesticides create a pro-inflammatory state in the gut. And here's the big thing, and why I wrote it down, is that it was found to also disrupt microbial gene expression. Can you talk about the impact that that industrial agriculture has had on our gut health? Because this is something you address in the book, and it's a really big deal.
Yeah, this is a big thing. So industrial agriculture essentially is chemical agriculture. It's gone from an organic agriculture that is indigenous people use that way, with natural fertilizers from the farm animals that go back into the ground. So what modern agriculture has done, particularly or increasingly in the last 75 years since World War II, to increase productivity and output, and feeding the world, and that actually has been successful, but at a very high cost, because putting all these chemicals not just into the soil, has killed a lot of the microbes. So similar to what we've done with antibiotics in humans, has a good side, wonderful side, but at the same time has a hidden cost that we now realize. The second thing is by killing a lot of the microbial ecosystems in the soil, the plants have lost the ability to produce their own medicine, which is a group of molecules called polyphenols. And I mean, that's a whole topic for, we could talk about this for an hour, one of my favorite topics, that the soil microbes stimulate the plant roots to produce these molecules that then are transported up the stem of the plant into their leaves, into their fruit, and defend them against any kind of stress. So it could be chemical stress, could be insecticides, could be drought, anything that stresses the plant generates a signal down into the root system to communicate with the microbes in the soil, which then stimulates this medicine production, these phytochemicals. And in industrial agriculture, that's greatly diminished. So that results in the need for pesticides and insecticides, because these plants are no longer, they grow like crazy as long as you kill everything else around it.
Right, they're not adaptable.
So they're not adaptable, and so you start out with killing the microbes in the soil, then you have to start killing all the bugs and the pests that could compromise this plant because it's no longer producing its own medicine. And so that's created this vicious cycle that we're now producing plants that look beautiful. You go to Galsense or Whole Food Market and see these beautiful looking, but the nutrient content is not the same, because these molecules that protect the plant at the same time are the main components of the nutrients that are contained in the plants. And when we eat these plants, a big health benefit is not just the fiber, but it's also these plant medicine molecules,
like polyphenols.
Like polyphenols. And so we're now eating a diet that's really greatly diminished in this. And so industrial agriculture, I like to call it chemical agriculture, has really played a major role. And we're kind of coming back to realize that now. There are some pioneers that promote this regenerative organic agriculture. Regenerative means you put things back into the soil. You don't just constantly extract things from it, but you put it back to the microbes can grow and you restore that ecosystem. So, there's people like... the people behind Kiss the Ground movie, it's a good example. Yvonne Chouinard from Patagonia is another example who's really been pushing this concept. And so Ryland Engelhardt is the mind behind the Kiss the Ground group and the movie. So there's a growing number of people, and they have a plan to really change agriculture back into a regenerative organic system, which would solve a lot of problems. Because one of the things also, so we don't really know what some of these pesticides and insecticides do to the plant and then to our own, because we eat the plants, to our own microbial ecosystem. Just for glyphosate, to get FDA approval, they only had to do a few studies, short-term studies in cultures of cells, and they found in human cells, and they found that glyphosate exposure, so the substance, that is Roundup, that glyphosate exposure did not really affect human cells, because human cells don't have that shiitake pathway to metabolize it. So they concluded from a few short-term studies, it's safe, it doesn't affect human cells.
This is fine.
This is way before the microbiome science came out.
Right.
So in the meantime, we know, microbes can break down most chemicals that we ingest, including glyphosate. And believe it or not, there's very little science on that. And I don't know, it almost seems like I hate to be, a conspiracy theorist, but it's almost like if that science is not supported, is not like you won't get funded doing this, because the commercial interest and the lobby behind that industry is so gigantic that, I don't know. I don't want to get into any sort of political implications of this, but there's certainly, it's very surprising that at the time where we're so conscious of, the health, the gut health and everything, that there's not a flurry of studies that show definitively that glyphosate does harm not just our microbiome, but also secondarily our own health.
Yeah, the regulatory systems are really backwards because we're trying to prove that they're hurting us instead of proving that they're not hurting us.
Yeah.
It's really backwards. And it should be obvious, again, like these are newly invented compounds. With the EPA, for example, there's like close to 40,000 chemicals approved for use in fertilizers. Like it's so many, it's insane. And once we get in this conversation, so I mentioned earlier about directly damaging microbial gene expression, but that's just one part of it because the ingestion of these chemicals can disrupt our microbiome, but also the lack of key nutrients. Even if we're eating organic, the foods that we're eating today are lacking on these nutrients that feed our microbes. And so this is what I want to ask you about next, because we've seen a direct impact, and you highlight this in the book, and it's so important. The direct impact is a vastly declining richness and diversity of our microbes. So can you talk about those two different things and the current state of our microbes versus people who are eating more of a normal diet?
Yeah, so just explain these two terms, and they are important. So, that applies to any ecosystem. So the richness and diversity applies, it's not just for the microbiome, but so diversity means, how many different species of organisms are there. And that could, so high diversity would be something, if you extrapolate this to a city, if you have one couple from Latin America, and one couple from African American, and one couple, from Asia, and the rest is all Caucasian. So that's a diverse ecosystem because you have 4 different, and it could be more diverse. But it's not necessarily a healthy ecosystem because that one representation of one species is not sufficient. You need a richness. So you need, if you divide up the population, you would want to have 25% of each of these populations populating that ecosystem. And so you need, and that's the richness. So you need the richness and the diversity in order to get, so the main property then of such an ecosystem is it's resilient against perturbations. It's very, anything you do to it, it will bounce back. It will not, something will break down. And it will be resistant to change. And that's clearly a property of our own, microbiome. It's a good and a bad thing. The good thing is, if you eat something, get a GI infection, you eat something bad, or have a stomach flu, it doesn't knock out your system. It always comes back almost. The same with if you take an antibiotic once, it doesn't knock out your system, even though you kill or suppress a lot of the organisms. It comes back because of its resistance or resilience to perturbation. The bad thing is if you want to restore a sick microbiome, like we do in, so there's a lot of attempts now with this fecal microbial transplant. Because we can do this in mice, artificial models, that you take a rich, diverse, healthy microbiome and put this into a mouse gut. You can do all kinds of things. You can make an obese mouse lean. You can make a depressed mouse normal behavior. But you can only do this because these mice start out, these laboratory mice, without having any microbes. And so the so-called germ-free mice. So in a situation like that, yes, you can change it if you put something in. But even in people that have a compromised microbiome, it's still resilient. So it won't allow you to do that. It will not, if you do there's very few conditions, there's actually literally just one condition where a fecal microbial transplant in humans has really worked. And that's because, again, the resilience and the resistance for change. Our microbial this ecosystem has been declining in both diversity and richness. So we are losing, and that's just kind of perpetuated through generations. It gets worse, a little bit worse in each generation. We've been losing a lot of this diversity and richness, and some strains have disappeared that you find in populations like hunter-gatherer remnants in the world. So we've lost a lot of these species, not species as much, but strains, and this is continuing. If you don't change something dramatically in how we interact with the environment and with our food and with the chemicals we use, this will continue. And some people have predicted it will lead to massive pandemics. Because it makes us more and more vulnerable to infections. And it's interesting. So a book came out a few years before the pandemic, Missing Microbes by Marty Blaser. And in his last chapter, he talks about this, the threat of pandemics. This was way before the actual pandemic we're in now. And so we got a taste of it, what can come even worse in the future, I think.
This is really getting to a place of something very visceral for us, because we're seeing, again, firsthand what you can really see coming from a mile away, and understanding that truly a big regulatory force of what we see as our immune system has so much to do with the health of our gut. And in the book, you also detail, again, there's a decline. If you want to look at it like an analogy of like a rainforest and this loss of species, and how does that affect other species and the richness and diversity. And we've been losing these strains. Many have gone extinct. Many are they're on the endangered list, and so we still have an opportunity to kind of turn these things around. But I sent this paper over to you, and I knew that you had already seen it, but I wanted to ask you about this because you also mentioned with the richness, it really holds within it its ability to bounce back when we have any kind of intrusions or any abnormalities. It's the ability to bounce back. And this recent paper was published in the journal Gut, and it's titled Gut Microbiota Composition Reflects Disease Severity and Dysfunctional Immune Responses in Patients with COVID-19. And the researchers uncovered that hospitalized COVID-19 patients consistently had lower levels of immunomodulatory bacteria, coinciding with higher levels of inflammation. And you would think that this would be getting more attention. And what I noticed also with the study that kind of jumped out afterwards, and even more so now talking with you, is that they noted that even after they, quote, cleared the virus, their microbes didn't bounce back. It was still at that kind of decline state where they're missing microbes that are associated with robust immune function.
Yeah, no, this is a very interesting point. It has not received, this will receive a lot more attention. I'm sure there's so much research going on in this field that in the next 5 years we'll see papers coming out on many aspects.
We need it yesterday, though.
Yeah. So we've been so absorbed with fighting the pandemic and the vaccine development, which was phenomenal from a scientific standpoint. Less so from preventing the next one, and the next one will come. If you see, we've had several smaller ones. But with all the things going on that we've talked about before, the likelihood of these events is increasing. So, what is the connections? So, COVID-19 enters, our body really through the respiratory system. So you're wondering, what does the gut have to do with it? But then we talked earlier also about the fact that 70% of the immune system is in the gut, and a lot of the programming and modulation of the immune system that then goes to all the other organs happens at the gut level. So the microbes have a big word to say on that. And so the finding that they reported there, could be interpreted in two ways. One is, if you have a compromised if you have a compromised gut microbial system, that by itself will increase the risk that you have exaggerated immune responses to any perturbation. And so it's quite possible that these people that they studied, they had these abnormalities before they got infected. In this study, this wasn't they brought in people that were infected and studied them. But in a real longitudinal study, you would want to know, and these studies are coming out, somebody who didn't have it and then developed it, did they have this microbial abnormality before that put them at an increased risk? And I would say that's the more likely,
Right.
because we also know, so some people got a more severe form of the infection. Some develop this long COVID phenomenon that the symptoms don't go away. And people that are at a higher risk of developing these more severe forms are, so we know who these high-risk populations are. Unfortunately, it breaks down along socioeconomic categories with socioeconomic, even racial, and it's probably not genetic. It's probably the correlation of socioeconomic with racial.
Environment.
The environment. So that a big part of our population eats very unhealthy food, either because it's cheaper or because they don't have access to the whole food markets and all these healthy things that are being promoted, like on the west side of LA. It's not, you go to downtown areas, you don't see the same. So those segments of the population had a much higher risk of not just getting it, but getting a more severe form, and also for this long COVID complication. And we know people that are on this poor diet, have a compromised microbial ecosystem, and they're missing exactly those organisms that they found in these patients. So I think there's a pretty good link between, and it spans, from. It's not just a biological thing. It's also sociological. It's a political thing that hopefully will draw more attention to populations that were most severely affected. And it's in the jargon of the discussion in the media, it's always said, well, it's the people that have more comorbidities that were more likely to develop the more severe form. Well, what these comorbidities are, as I point out in my book, are the consequence of a unhealthy gut microbiome and overreactive immune system. So it all fits together, and I think regardless where this infection attacks your body, it will always be influenced by what goes in, by your gut health and indirectly then by the things that you feed your gut, your microbes.
Yeah. There's so much here, and I want to ask you about one of the common treatments that was being used for COVID very early on that you mentioned in the book. A significant number of folks coming in with COVID were being treated with antibiotics. So can you talk about that intersection with our declining richness and diversity in microbes and our rampant use and often overuse and often inappropriate use of antibiotics, when in this case we were even dealing with a viral infection?
Yeah, and again, coming back to this book, Missing Microbes from Marty Blazer, he put this, this is his main area of research, and in the meantime, a lot of people have picked up on that idea that we overuse antibiotics dramatically. Antibiotics are the most important medical invention, I would say, that has saved millions, hundreds of millions of lives. But when it's used indiscriminately and without the proper indications, it has a huge collateral damage on primarily on this microbial world, and it's in different ways. It's it starts at the time of delivery. So prophylactic administration of antibiotics to women during delivery to prevent potential serious streptococcal infections, gives the first blast of this microbial, I would call it poison, to the emerging microbiome in the infant. Then, a lot of babies now are born prematurely. They end up in the neonatal intensive care unit. Intensive exposure to antibiotics for often for weeks, to prevent infections. And then there's also, so the whole sterile environment during delivery that is typical for hospitals. So the exposure of the infant coming through the birth canal is also compromised. So we've done with antibiotics everything possible, even in the first days of life, to compromise that system. And it hasn't really changed dramatically. This has not changed. But then it goes on. If you look at the statistics of how many doses of antibiotics a 2-year-old in the US is getting by the age of 2, it's something between 5 and 10 doses of antibiotics, which is unbelievable. And then that increases over time. Part of the fault are overly concerned mothers, hypervigilant mothers, who think every time the kid has a severe respiratory tract infection, they need to get an antibiotic, and they go to their physician. And many GPs or pediatricians will then give in and say, here's the prescription. And we know that viruses do not respond to antibiotics, so it's a complete ineffective treatment, which has this major damaging effect on the evolving microbiome. And this early phase is particularly important because the microbiome is programmed the first 3 years of life. The basic design, the basic ecosystem design is accomplished in the first 3 years. And so everything that you do during that time, it's particularly vulnerable. So we all, most people in Western societies go into this world with an antibiotic compromised microbiome system. The effect later in life is not as dramatic. So there's studies. Most people bounce back, and we come back to the resilience from one dose of an antibiotic. A lot of people bounce back after 3 doses. But then depending on how stable your ecosystem is, some people will not bounce back, and they will then have, so if as an adult, if you have a history of having received a lot of antibiotics as an infant, and now you get 1 or 2 or 3 courses of antibiotics, your microbiome will further be compromised. And we do this still today, a condition called irritable bowel syndrome, common condition, or IBS. So one of the FDA-approved therapies is treatment with an antibiotic, which, when you think about the implications of what I just told you, is the last thing you would want to do. Patients feel temporarily better with that antibiotic, but many of them, the symptoms come back, and then the response is, well, let's do another dose. And I've had patients who had 10 doses of this antibiotic, So clinical medicine has not learned, in my opinion, enough from the insights that we have now about this damaging effect. It's not the only reason, I think, that we see this progressively declining diversity and richness of the microbiome, and the increase of diseases related to this, like autoimmune diseases or allergies, but it's definitely a big one, and which could easily be changed.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's setting us up for more long-term problems potentially. And you also mentioned that this was a game changer in health and having so many advantageous uses, but it's just kind of been transitioned into a place where it's a thing that we quickly jump to. And as you mentioned, from patients demanding it to healthcare practitioners being a little bit overzealous, or being very quick to pass out a prescription for antibiotic, when I think we've also gotten to a place where we're not used to just being sick as well, like colds and flus and things of that nature, and allowing our bodies to recover. And I think that our bodies are also having a harder time recovering because of the loss of all these microbes. And I want to mention this too, because you mentioned the inoculation when we first come into the world. So that bathing and that kind of download, in a sense, of our of our bacteria cascade, and plus making it a more and more sterile environment that we're living in, that our kids are living in. And this is what I want to ask you about, which is, in the book, you highlight something that should just jump right out at us, is the fact that our chronic diseases, not just infectious diseases, but chronic diseases, are happening in younger and younger populations now, whether it's hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, the list goes on. And you make the connection between that and our microbes as well.
Yeah, so this is one of the more worrisome trends, and one particularly striking example to me is being a gastroenterologist. So the colon cancer screening guidelines, that used to be at age 50, and then people have found, and this colon cancer screening has had a beneficial effect. So fewer people die from colon cancer. But what's been noticed that the onset of colon, or the first appearance of colon cancer, has gone down to age 40. So now it's not a complication of people getting older, but it's really a younger population. Similar things have happened with diabetes, with autoimmune diseases like inflammatory bowel disease. In all these seemingly unrelated diseases, we see this phenomenon that on the one side, these diseases are starting or exploding also in the developing world, not just in the developed world, but they starting at young and younger age, which goes along with what we talked about, this onslaught, this massive attack, this warfare really on microbes that we don't perceive as warfare, we perceive it as treatments. But I think this mindset really has to change, and it's a combination. Initially it's always, particularly for the lay public, it's easier to say, okay, it's the antibiotics, but in the meantime we know it's these multiple things that are happening at the same time. It's the changes in the diet the last 75 years, which obviously also affect the microbes. It's the amount of chemicals, or what we call xenobiotics in science, that we expose our microbiome to. So all these things have been increasing, and what we see now on a macroscopic level, that we see these diseases coming early in life. People don't, this is also a hallmark of this, people don't die as often from them. So and the only reason is, it's not because these diseases are decreasing in their frequency. It's because we're throwing a massive amount of medications at this problem to suppress the immune system.
So the process of dying is longer.
The process of dying is longer. It's not a healthy longevity. It's a longevity bought with the price of more and more medications that everybody automatically gets, like our statins, for metabolic syndrome, for heart disease. So our society has really responded to these changes that we now understand why they're happening, not with going to the root cause, but by throwing, this, from a scientific standpoint, it's phenomenal what these medications do, but it's not a solution to this problem. We can't continue like that. So I think people to realize that. And one last thing about the antibiotics, and we forgot one source, is this exposure of our farm animals to antibiotics. So we consume meat from animals that is soaked with antibiotics.
I believe 80% of the antibiotics used in our country is for cattle.
Yeah, so even if you think, so you've gone through a natural birth at home, without the sterile hospital environment, if you eat the regular food supply, you'll still get your sufficient dose of antibiotics, and with animals, they're not even being used to, they're being used to keep them from getting sick because of the unhealthy environment that we raise our farm animals, but also to stimulate their growth. So, for two reasons. For chickens, the same thing. In chickens, most diseases in chickens are viral. So we're doing the same mistake with throwing antibiotics at them, where we know, they don't do anything for these viral problems. Many examples in our food supply, shrimp farms, throwing tons of antibiotics into these shrimp farms. Main diseases of shrimp are viral. And so it's a pretty sad state, and it's going to take dramatic efforts on all levels, from the political lobbying, really curtailing lobbying efforts to the aware consumer. I mean, that's ultimately where it ends up. So if people don't buy the products, then, there's not a market. And then, so I think what people like us can do, we can raise awareness,
I really want everybody to get this. You just said something, one of the most mind-blowing things, which is, sure, we've got antibiotics in cattle feed to protect them against disease from the abnormal diets that they're being fed, the soy and all these things, even candy. There's practices where cows are being fed candy, for example. True, wrappers and all. We'll put the video for everybody in the show notes. But then, but the main purpose of the antibiotics is to help them to gain weight faster. Mm-hmm. And I really want everybody to get this, because you also touch on this in the book as well. The connection between the health of our microbiome and obesity and metabolic diseases and these things, again, that have skyrocketed. Changing that microbial cascade can make us better at assimilating calories, for example, better at adding weight to our frame, not based on the diet necessarily strictly alone, which is a huge part, and I want to talk more about that, but the change in our microbes can affect our body composition.
Yeah, so this is interesting that this phenomenon that veterinarians and the meat industry figured out a long time ago, that you can actually they didn't think about the gut microbes of the cows, that played a role in it, but now we know that our gut microbial system plays a big role in obesity, and particularly metabolic syndrome with the immune activation that goes along with that. That what benefited us on one side in industrial agriculture turns out to be sort of a major factor now in our current healthcare crisis related to. I would say the obesity part is obviously something is a big problem. It's medically, it's more important the associated metabolic derangements that come with increased body weight and body mass index. So and it is shocking that again we're sort of adapting to this problem by now it's no longer politically correct to, like, if you want to make a Facebook post and it has a picture of an obese person in it, or mention the word obesity or overweight, then that's not politically correct, and you may actually risk that it's taken down. So it's trying to normalize that phenomenon, which is crazy. I think people should much rather focus on what can I do not to go down this road of feeling okay if I'm overweight.
Yeah, because really what we're looking at is health, and I think that this is being reframed in a sense that it makes us, instead of looking at the health implications, like, hey, you're increasing all-cause mortality in your life for diabetes, for heart attacks, for the list goes on and on, rapid increases in autoimmune conditions, neurodegenerative conditions, the list goes on and on. And instead of us addressing the underlying issue, we're just normalizing things. And I think that, and I love the fact in the book, because I haven't really seen this research in book form much of anywhere else except, in some of the books that I've written, like coming out of the Weizmann Institute. You mentioned some of their data in your book as well. And they did this really fascinating study. They had folks across different time zones, and they seen the change and shift in their cascade of bacteria, shifting to that which looks more like that of a person who is overweight or obese. And so they took those samples from these folks and implanted them, fecal samples, into lean mice when they have this, quote, fat bacteria cascade. Mm-hmm. And they also took bacteria samples from people who had a bacteria cascade associated with leanness and just, quote, normal, and implanted that into lean mice. The lean mice who received that bacteria, nothing changed. But the mice who received the fecal transplant from humans who had the bacteria shift to more of a cascade associated with obesity, these mice became insulin resistant. They gained weight and they gained body fat, not changing anything else about their diet, simply from changing their microbes. And so I want people to really get the power of this in all aspects. And I want to circle back because this was one of the, I had to put the book down for a second and just sit with this after I read this statistic. One of the biggest issues we've seen recently in our culture is this skyrocketing incidence of autoimmune conditions, right? This used to be something that was pretty rare in our population. Now it's become so normal. And the number, and I'd never seen the number firsthand, about 50 million US citizens have an autoimmune condition now that they're struggling with. And so can you talk about that aspect? Why are we seeing, which we already know the answer, such a rampant increase in autoimmune conditions? And how does this play into kind of sorting out, and this is what I want to transition into, how can we address this? How can we fix this, the root, and stop treating the symptoms?
Yeah, so the autoimmune conditions, the story is a little bit different from these other metabolic conditions and these, this chronic non-infectious disease epidemic that we see in the heart and, colon cancer and neurodegenerative diseases. This is something that starts, again, early in life. So not only do we program our gut microbiome early in life, but we also train our immune system early in life to differentiate between harmful and non-harmful influences and differentiate between self and non-self. So self normally is perceived as a beneficial or should be tolerated. Non-self should be attacked. So with all these things that we talked about early on, this increasing hygiene, the being removed from farm animals, from dirt, from the soil, from everything is being disinfected. So this increasing hygiene, and so they gave this whole this whole area this name, the hygiene hypothesis, that we're no longer exposed to things like even parasites like worms, which were very common, even probably 50, 70 years ago in kids to have a phase where they have worms. Also organisms like H. pylori that plays a big role in ulcer disease, but which has lived with us for hundreds of thousands of years with humans. And all these organisms and the parasites that in a young age, if the immune system is exposed to these, they train the immune system that this is not something that needs to be killed. And so this training phase requires influences from the environment, the exposures of non-lethal but still foreign influences. And we've eliminated a lot of this, in this, including the H. pylori, almost eradicated completely. We don't know what the long-term effects of that is on. There were many benign forms of infections and infestations. So now the immune system, or the infant with the immune system in that infant grows up without lessons of how to differentiate between self and non-self and good and bad. Mm-hmm. And
so this is our also rapid increase in allergies.
Exactly. So it's so now we have this uneducated immune system that's hyperreactive to a lot of things that should not trigger this immune response. And so I bring up this example that our microbes are rapidly adaptive, have this ability to rapidly adapt to new situations, including this new century of extreme hygiene and in eliminating many organisms that we think are harmful. But the human immune system doesn't have that rapid. None of the human cells had that rapid adaptability. They react in the way that they have been designed by our 20,000 genes, in a way that if something doesn't make sense, they ring the alarm bell. So now you have this rapidly changing different microbiome system that interacts with a much more conservative and less reactive immune system, and that triggers the alarm bells all the time. And something similar has happened. It's a little bit of a detour here, but I think it's a similarity. We have this phenomenal stress response system in our brain. I mean, the immune system is a stress response system. Yeah. We have another stress response system in our brain, which has saved our species, over evolution many, many times. Not just ours, but every animal has that same system. It's the fight and flight response, and so today, we don't have these kind of stresses. At least for the majority of the population. Still goes on in the world, obviously, to a large degree. But in developed societies, it's much less common. But what we do have is a chronic exposure to an increasing level of stress. And that comes together with this, more conservative stress response system in our brain, which triggers the alarm bells now constantly, and similar what the immune system does. So we have two systems that developed in evolution that now in modern world become, what we call maladaptive. They start causing diseases rather than protecting us against them. Yeah. So I think that's what we're seeing. And they interact, this chronic stress interacts with the poor situation, the compromised situation at our gut level.
Yeah. You did highlight that as well in the book about stress, even acute stress, creating disruption with our microbes. But now we're just living in a constant fever, like a low-grade fever of stress. And I wanted to ask you about this because I've been staying on top of the data since the very beginning. It's really about the questions you ask. And now we've got papers on the psychosomatic effects of COVID-19, for example. And I know for certain, and again, I could see this coming from a mile away, that there's a difference between healthy caution, being conscientious, and being inundated with fear, and there's been such a campaign of fear that none of us have seen before in our lifetimes. And to the point where people, of course, just feeling very paralyzed and disempowered. And I know for certain that has had a major impact on our immune system function. But now you even bring to the forefront that this even disrupts our microbial function, which is really the house in which our immune system is existing in the first place.
Yeah, and so this whole idea of how stress, acute stress, but probably in a somewhat different way, but equally disruptive. So acute stress leads to this, upregulation of the immune system response to defend you against, in this particular situation. Chronic stress often, goes in a different direction. And it's really important to realize stress is not just something that happens at your brain level. It's almost like you have a mirror image of that state at your gut level, and every part of your gut, the peristalsis, the contractions, the secretions of fluid, acid secretion, mucus secretion, everything is affected by stress. If you take a stressed individual, either with an acute severe stress or a prolonged chronic stress, and you could characterize all the systems in your gut, they'll all be altered, and so not only the habitat in which the microbes live in is altered, but also some of these neurotransmitters, these stress mediators, affect the microbes directly. They have receptors for our own stress mediators. So it changes their behavior as well. It makes them more aggressive. So if you have if you have an enteric infection and you're in a chronically stressed state, and so this is a very common thing. So people go go to Mexico, get a GI infection. There've been studies. If people go to Mexico when they're really stressed to de-stress, and they get one of these infections, it lasts longer and it's more severe, as if somebody is in a completely relaxed state to go on a week to, to Cabo or somewhere. It's so.
Get that south of the border surprise.
Yeah, and it's clearly a reflection of what happens in your brain ongoing. We knew this for a long time, but now we know the microbes are also are affected equally in a direct way by changing their behavior, their gene expression, but also changing their habitat so we know we lose certain lactobacilli during stress, and that has consequences downstream. But we also make individual pathogens more aggressive to attack our gut and interact with our immune system.
Yeah. So this should seem obvious again at this point. I think I've said that several times during this episode, but it's clearly, and now we have some peer-reviewed evidence coming out that it's created worse health outcomes for us when we come into interaction with viral strains like COVID-19, for example. We should be stacking conditions in our favor to have a more favorable response, because we're going to be exposed to novel things. Like, this is just one. And yet the way that we've gone about this, I really think that we're kind of set up for worse health outcomes. Like, as a society, we're even less healthy than we were at the beginning of this, more sedentary, more abnormal sleep patterns, eating more processed foods. We've gained more weight. The list goes on and on. And now I would really love to circle back, because you said this term and it burned me a little bit when you said it, because it really does fit. And you said warfare, and putting it in that term it can seem a little bit inflammatory, but it sort of is, because we're going to war with the environment around us to destroy all of these microscopic organisms, not understand that we're made of microscopic organisms. And in a sense, this is like war against ourselves, and we don't even realize it. And I was watching this commercial the other day from, it was one of the big airline companies, and they were just smiling and showing how they're spraying the planes down with the electrostatic, sprayers and all these chemicals. And they're like, look, guys, look how safe it is now. And I can't help but wonder, what is that going to do to our microbiome? And it's not just rooted in our gut as well. We have a microbiome in our lungs. We have our skin. The list goes on and on. We don't know what these things are doing to us. In this effort to defend us from something kind of abstract, and knowing that our bodies would be better defended if we had a healthier microbial cascade against anything we're faced with. I would love to talk about now, what are some of the things that we can do to address this, and going all the way back to for kids and coming up in a sterile environment. There's a time and place to use some hand sanitizer, for example, but having it at the doorway and doing it 12 times a day, maybe it might be overkill, literally, because we have to have a healthy interaction to develop and support our immune system. So whether it's, connection with people, whether it's, being more judicious in our use of, all these sanitation practices, what are some of the things that we can do to help to rebuild and fortify our immune system and our microbiota?
Yeah, so certainly in terms of the environmental exposure to microbes, being in spending more time in green spaces. Something that has happened automatically. It was a good thing that more families have selected or decided to have pets at home. So pets are definitely one source of microbes that infants or any animal really, and it's unlikely that we will be exposed more to farm animals. Nobody's going to move, and even though some people may want to think about this, to spend their vacation on a farm, when they have young kids, have their kids play in soil, in natural. I think in cities that is mainly in park spaces. Diet-wise, clearly the biggest variety of plant-based foods, which more or less, forces the gut microbiome to come up with with all sorts of microbes that are specialized on these different fiber products and polyphenol products from the plant. So the more diverse it is, the more you really force your microbial ecosystem to be diverse. I would say, the use of disinfectants and that will certainly go down from the extreme situation initially. So, my wife came home from shopping and wiped every
my wife too.
food item, which is a terrible thing because food is a big source of beneficial microbes. Not just in yogurt or in fermented products, but if you look at the studies on an organically grown apple, there's a huge amount of microbes on that apple. When you so many of our apples, obviously, they're polished and waxed and everything. They don't have this anymore, but to find the balance between being careful and people still talking about we're not completely through this pandemic. There may be variants, so this what you talked about earlier, this constant fear that's implanted in our brain. This may not be over. There may still be. So we'll continue to be extremely hygienic. But I would say from diet, mindset, as we talked about, stress is definitely something that is almost as bad on the microbial and gut health as diet is, and exposure to sources of outside microbes from our the food that we get, the people we interact with, physical touch. That probably has not changed in families, but it's changed with other groups, social groups. We actually don't know what the impact of that, all the things we did during the pandemic had on our microbiome. I don't think we know the studies, that looked at people that stayed healthy before the problem started to now. Did that lead to a decrease in our diversity, and will there be a delayed increase in autoimmune diseases? Will this boost the? But it's not easy. More and more people live in big cities, in apartments. Like you take a place like New York City, in small apartments, and it's not easy to sort of come up with, well, let's go back to the way it used to be, that you played out in nature and and it was easy to access the healthiest food. It's not that easy. I think it takes a real conscious effort by people who do that. If any of the supplements, this is something that a lot of people started a huge business during the pandemic. Let's strengthen our gut immunity. If any of these things really have a significant benefit on this problem, quite honestly, I doubt it. There may in the future be, there may be things like, polyphenol supplements that may have a benefit. We don't know that yet, but.
And that's even addressing it more at the root, which is the polyphenols feeding the microbes. Yeah. But you go through and you talk about, there's been a major shift in awareness of the importance of probiotics, for example. And so people I just need a probiotic. But there's very little clinical evidence that they're effective, especially when people are maintaining and doing the same things they're already doing, like this magical pill is going to fix the problem. Yeah,
this is a very important point. If you maintain your lifestyle, the way it's been before, and then you think you now taking this probiotic that has 10 different organisms in it and in billions of concentration.
75 million billion strains.
It's just, if you think that counteracts, your lifestyle impact on gut immunity and gut health, it's a pure placebo. That if you change your lifestyle and you add certain supplements, I've sort of gone back and forth with this to further enhance it. Some of these anti-inflammatory substances like turmeric or certain polyphenols
in green tea, for example.
or green tea, there may be a benefit to it. But as you said, the scientific, we don't have the scientific studies, and we'll probably never get them, because these companies sell enough of these supplements without science. It's almost like something people are willing to spend a lot of money on many of these things without ever having seen the evidence.
Let's talk about how something like intermittent fasting affects the microbiome.
Yeah, so a very interesting thing comes back to, one of the things that I promote in the book. It's important what you eat and where the food comes from and when you eat it. It's really these three criteria. There's been a lot of studies in animals, in mice, on longevity and on metabolic health over probably 3 decades, all of which pointed in a beneficial effect of intermittent fasting. There's some human studies, growing number of human studies now that try to demonstrate that works in humans as well. And during the study period, many of these are effective, decreasing inflammatory molecules in your body, weight loss. The problem with most intermittent fasting is that it's probably not practical for the majority of people. That's what I would say. And the reason that if you follow somebody after a year, most people have regained their weight and have switched back to their old metabolic derangement. So one of those techniques, this time-restricted eating, I find the most attractive, and can't back it up with a ton of human research, but it's certainly practical. So we've done this in our own family during the pandemic, where you could experiment with this better because you didn't have to commute and everything. And so we basically compress the time where you put food into your intestine to 8 hours or less, and leave it empty for 16 hours. That has a lot of theoretical benefits just on the gut itself. This having an empty gut will completely switch the contractile activity of your gut, the peristalsis, from a pattern where you grind and go back and forth and maximize absorption, to one pattern that goes a big contractile wave going through your gut from the esophagus to the end of your intestine every 90 minutes, like a clockwork. That's probably one of the most important mechanisms to keep microbes, high density microbes, out of your small intestine. It cleanses, prevents what now is received a lot of attention, the SIBO, or small bowel intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So it swipes everything down into the colon where most microbes belong to. So it does that. At the same time, there's a wave of secretions that goes with these contractions. And so that alone is almost certainly beneficial for your health, for your gut microbial health and your gut health, and it's anti-inflammatory. So now we know from studies at the Weizmann Institute that you mentioned, that there's this diurnal variation of how close the microbes get to cells that line the gut and to the immune cells. So the distance between them and the mucus layer varies between day and night. And so the longer the gut is empty, you have this more beneficial interactions of the microbes with the gut as opposed to when you feed it. It's also something of our modern lifestyle that we have shortened that empty period by snacking, staying up till midnight or later, snacking during that time, and really reducing that window of where the gut is empty to just a few hours. So I would say, and there are enough encouraging studies from mice. For example, one of the most impressive mouse studies is that they put mice on this what's called a cafeteria diet, which makes it's high fat, high sugar, where they gain a lot of weight and develop metabolic abnormalities. If you give that exact same diet with a time restriction, just in the 8-hour period, and obviously in the mouse it's kind of opposite because they are active during during nighttime, but it's the same time windows. If you give this in a time-restricted fashion, as opposed to letting the mice have access to it all the time, the mice that eat the same amount of calories during this time-restricted pattern will not gain weight, will lose weight, and will be metabolically healthy as opposed to the others. So that's probably one of the strongest pieces of evidence. And there's now evidence from some human studies, not 100% consistent, that that's the case in humans as well. And it makes a lot of sense. You know, it's returning to our natural diurnal cycle, really, in terms of our food intake.
You just said something really remarkable, which is the same amount of calories consumed, but in that shortened window, it has this kind of protective effect in a sense. But I think it's beyond a protective effect, but there's these beneficial things that happen, like you know this as well, but I don't think we've made the connection to how our gut and our microbiota are influencing the increase in BDNF, the increase in autophagy and all these things. It's really rooted in what's happening with our gut, like signing the check for these things. And you also mentioned staying up late. And I love that you had this in the book as well, because it's not just about our food, which you repeatedly throughout the book talk about real foods kind of functioning as this prebiotic source for our microbes to flourish. So real whole foods, a lot of plant-based foods. But I know you don't know this, but in my first book, Sleep Smarter, and this came out, I think it's about 5 years ago now, there's a chapter called Fix Your Gut to Fix Your Sleep. And I have many of the same tenets, which it's not trying to throw a pill at it, but what are some of the foundational things? And that's what I want to ask you about this, because how in the world can our sleep patterns influence what's happening with our gut? Because one of the things that I was kicking around at the time was that it seems to be like there's a changing of the guard that kind of takes place with our sleep patterns, with what's happening with the activity in our microbes. Kind of like our microbes need sleep too, or need rest too, in a sense.
Yeah, and you know, there are, I mean, certainly we know that during REM sleep, so we have these different sleep phases, and during REM sleep, there's this massive activation of the autonomic nervous system that affects, you know, all parts of our body. The heart beats faster, and blood pressure goes up, and that also affects the GI tract, you know, and so this normal cycling between REM and non-REM sleep is definitely something that the microbes experience in a significant way, and which will affect. So, you know, so the people at the Weizmann Institute call this the geography of the microbiome, how close they get to the gut wall, and how close or how much they're able to affect gene expression in intestinal cells and in immune cells, which then goes from the gut to the liver and affects, you know, metabolism in the liver. And so, yeah, it is kind of remarkable when you think about it, is that, you know, REM sleep and when we had these vivid dreams, the only reason we don't wake up is because the brain inhibits our muscular system at the same time. But it's as if we are in very emotionally arousing situations, you know, several times during the night. And so clearly what we know about microbial changes during emotional situations, that happens during the sleep just as it does when we wake. We just don't know about it, you know. And from a general standpoint, one property of healthy ecosystems are temporal oscillations or variations. So the healthier a system is, the more regular are the oscillations, and so diurnal variations are the most important ones for life on Earth. But then there's others, you know, other frequencies of oscillations, food intake, and I think the more that we stick to these natural rhythms, the better it is for the ecosystems inside of us as well. The thing that we do, you know, sitting in front of the TV at night, it's not by coincidence that you're being bombarded by all these food advertisements, snacks, unhealthy foods. You know, it's not that.
Yeah, there's not a broccoli commercial on.
It's
the night show.
And you see this till midnight. You know, so, and we know that influences behavior. You go to the fridge when you see this, and you feel like you want to eat something. And ironically, at the same time, you see the commercials for how to treat your autoimmune diseases and your hyperimmune related diseases.
And your erectile dysfunction.
So you get both of those things at the same time. You know, it's ironic. You can actually learn a lot about how our society has moved away from a balanced, encouraging a balanced lifestyle, just watching the commercials,
right.
What goes on there, because it's very smart people that are behind these commercials.
And it's written, it's right there, right in front of our faces, but it's just kind of, we don't really see it anymore. It's just, we kind of see it as normal. So, well, basically picking up from that, we've got this powerful interaction between the health of our gut and influencing our sleep, and our sleep also influences the health of our gut. So these are deeply interacted and have a deep interactive relationship. So I put it like that. And one of the little fascinating nuggets, I'm just going to throw this out there. When I was in my university classes, I was taught that melatonin was produced in the pineal gland. That was it. Really that simple. But more recently, now we've seen that, and again, peer-reviewed evidence, there's upwards of 400 times more melatonin in our gut than in our brain at any given time. And you could even have your pineal gland removed, which I don't recommend, by the way, but your levels of melatonin will still remain relatively consistent, in your gut. So the story is so much bigger. And I love that. I'm so grateful to have you on, because you're somebody who's truly a pioneer. It's 40 years you've been in this space. And before we got started, I was like, people probably thought you were a little crazy talking about these things and this interaction. And now to see your work and all the things that you've planted start to sprout out throughout so many different areas of health and how everything is interconnected. What I know is going to happen is we're going to see more work being done around heart health in the gut, around lung health in the gut, around brain health in the gut. And with your last book, you really focused on the gut-brain connection. And now in this book, the gut-immune connection. And you didn't know the pandemic was going to happen, but you got to work on this subject matter because it is that important. So much of our immune system is rooted in our gut health. And the last thing I want to ask you about is the One Health concept that you talk about in the book. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the One Health concept is something, it's the last chapter of the book, not by coincidence, but going through all the individual systems, you ultimately realize, wow, this is all part of a health, and disease is all part of, is best understood if you study it as part of a systems problem, that at multiple levels, this global system, this One Health system can be affected, and then you have ripple effects. So if you start out with gut health, it's the health of the microbes and the way they interact with the immune system. But then you realize it's heavily influenced by what we feed our microbes, and then where does this food come from and what happened the way this food was produced. We talked about this a few times, the microbes in the soil, how they affect the nutrient content of the plants, and how that benefits our microbes. So to understand gut health and our brain health, so we think they're all different things. In medicine, there's specialists for all of these that deal as separate entities. But really, I think you have to look at all the other aspects that are related to this. The health of our environment that has affected the health of the soil, the health of our farm animals, and ultimately the health of the planet with climate change. Each of these things are in some ways interconnected. And I cited one study where they looked at microbial interactions of microbial systems in different parts of, so on animals in the soil, on humans, different parts of the water. And you can create a network of all of these microbes that in some ways are interacting with each other. And given the fact that they have millions or hundreds of millions of genes that can do all kinds of things, it sort of gives you this idea there's one underlying system that is being compromised now that creates disease states at multiple levels. And we unfortunately we live in a time where we see them all now. If you look at it with open eyes, from our gut health to our brain health to soil health, health to plants, animals, and the environment. I think this is something that should be taught to children early in school, that this interconnectedness of all these elements, that they all play a role in our health. So if you're concerned about the environment, you do something for your own health as well. Same thing, if you want to create the optimal diet and environment for your microbes, you need to think about the environmental health at the same time. So this term has been used, has been created. I forgot now where it first came from. The One Health, where it was animals and humans. But I think this goes much further. This really links every ecosystem on the planet together. And I spent a whole chapter in the book about explaining this whole network science that's beginning to explain this on a scientific level. And I think this is moving so rapidly in the scientific field that this will impact our understanding in medical textbooks, medical teaching in 10 years by the time it gets into the textbooks and to the curriculum. But it will definitely change the way we look at health in general.
Yeah, it takes time, and it's thanks to people like yourself putting the data together, making it make sense, and really pioneering against odds, against pressure, and making it available. But, like you mentioned, the change does take time, but it's happening right now. And so really grateful for you putting this together for everybody. Can you let everybody know where they can pick up your book and just anywhere they can get additional information?
Yeah, so, they can order from any bookseller as of Tuesday, June 8th. You can even pre-order it if you can't wait till Tuesday. More information on this whole topic that we've been discussing is on my website, emeranmeyer.com. And when you go to the website, it'll ask you to sign up for the newsletter, for the free newsletter, which will deal with topics from the mind to the gut and to the environment, to this One Health concept. It comes out every 2 weeks. And then, we're visible on all the social media, but all this information is on the website. So anybody who's interested in knowing more about this, order the book or order both books if you haven't read the first one, and go to the website.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is an incredibly important conversation and topic. And I think clearly, based on the evidence you've presented, that dialing in, focusing more on healing our gut, supporting our microbiome can really help to fortify our immune system moving forward. So I appreciate you so much for hanging out with us.
Well, thanks, Shawn. It was really a pleasure talking to you.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here to up-level your health today. Oftentimes when you have, an injury or an issue like this, we're told not to do anything. That's often the worst thing you can do, because things will start to atrophy. If you don't use it, you lose it.